They breached the iron gate at dawn like men breaking a promise. Chains dragged, flares struck, a diesel cough that woke every bird within earshot and did not wake the thing that watched from deeper dark. Tomas Varga stood on the running board of the lead bulldozer, jaw set like a hinge. And when the gravel under the treads screamed into mud, he felt, briefly, the ease of a man who believes the world is a ledger and every tree a column to balance. Then something moved in the trunks, subtle as a breath, and all the numbers in his head felt suddenly small. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The first morning was a manifesto of ordinary violence. Chainsaws spit like lit matchsticks. Men in orange vests argued over notches and load plans. A crane shuddered as it took the first cathedral of spruce and bore it away. Tomas barked orders in short sentences, each one a stone into a pool that stopped swirling only because the crew learned to duck the ripples. He had debts in a ledger as stubborn as the lines on his forehead. A boy named Doru who owed the county school a future stitched together from tuition and stubbornness. And a magistrate's approval stamped on permits like a benediction he could not afford to waste. To him, superstition was the moss on history, unsightly but ultimately ignorable. The forbidden woods were timber waiting for a contractor's courage and a machine's appetite. Mara Ionescu arrived with a notebook and a grief she had learned to keep quiet, a grief that sat at the base of her neck and flared every time she read the word forbidden. She was a conservation biologist hired by a rival firm to assess environmental risk, not to fight or plead. Her voice was measured, her eyes precise, but under the rationality lived a memory that hardened at the edges. Her brother, Andrei, had gone into these woods 10 years ago and never come back. Paperwork had become a ritual. Every species list, every canopy map, an excuse to come closer to the place that had swallowed him. She did not tell them about the dream she woke from sometimes. Andrei calling from a distance, saying only, "Don't cut the roots of the house," before the line went silent. Ilya Pushchin arrived last, walking the lane like a man who carries a boundary in his bones. He was the village ranger, sun-creased and slow to anger. His hands were calloused where his grandmother had taught him to knot ropes and to tie thorns into protective charms. The Pushchins had kept watch over the villages that ringed the forbidden woods for generations. They had a pact with the forest, a trade struck in old tongue in a time when bargains could be struck with things that had long memories. Ilya's grandmother, Magda, had made a plea once to an unnamed protector, and the forest had accepted. The cost was subtle at first. The wolves avoided the cattle, the chestnut groves thrived, the spring never failed. But when the village swore to forget the exact words of the pact and to pass down only the duty, the bargain's threads frayed. Ilya had once broken the rule, let a logging crew through a backtrack years ago, and his wife had left him for a man who kept his hands cleaner of the forest. He still kept the oath in a pocket of his chest, though he would not say the words aloud. They circled each other at the gate without speaking of their true selves. Tomas saw a woman who could complicate his permits. Mara saw a foreman whose smile was a calculating instrument. Ilya watched both, feeling like a mediator at a funeral where everyone expected dance. The first day, they were bound by maps and schedules, by the law's thin teeth. Tomas' men moved like practiced machine parts, and the forest answered with small indignities, equipment that misread depth markers, compasses that wavered, radio static that translated into something like sighing. The dogs the villagers had brought to keep wolves at bay whimpered and came back with fur matted and tails tucked. The ornithologists sent along to survey canopy-borne species reported silence where nests should have been. Probably spiders in the wiring, one logger said, smacking the radio. Tomas barked something about replacements and deadlines. But when the surveyor turned his recorder over and found the spectra on it folded into a tight, layered echo that mimicked a throat's low reprimand, he refused to let anyone near the deeper tracks. Tomas called it superstition and with a half-grimace placed his hand on Mara's arm, a touch casual enough to be a maneuver, not a comfort. Mara's notebook filled faster than she expected. Species counts, sapling diameters, erosion gradients. She annotated everything with a precision that betrayed the ache beneath. She had come to prove risk, to file a report that would slow the clear-cutting in favor of a protected corridor, protocol, cold and legal. But the forest made her metrics bleed into memory. At the first remnant clearing, she found shaving marks on a birch, artful bands peeled away like a rib cage. The pattern was not wolves, not beavers. It was something that worked and reworked wood as if it were reading the tree's history. Her fingers traced the grooves, and the air tasted like old rain. For a woman who had buried a brother in silence, touch is sometimes the only thing that counts, and she felt a recognition she didn't need documented. The village watched them through curtains and shuttered porches. Old women spat 3 times. Children formed games around the name Omul Padori until they could say it without fear. The mayor issued a statement. The contracts were signed. The jobs were local work. Tomas had brought men who would not ask questions about ghost stories or curses. He had also brought a bulldozer that had once cleared a landslide in a neighboring county and had been praised for saving lives. His pragmatism shone like oil on water, slick and hard to hold. It took one night for the edges to fray. A single worker, Mihai, who had been new to this line of back-breaking labor and had a laugh like a loose hinge, came back to the lot with a hand that bent wrong. It wasn't blood that shocked them so much as the way the hand looked as if roots had tried to claim it. Skin popped, and a fine, fibrous strand woven beneath like sapwood. The crew swore and wrapped it in industrial gauze, but the damage had been quick as a winter frost. Tomas' jaw closed. Injuries were a cost of business, he said, and invoices would cover it. But that night, men huddled around kerosene lamps and told stories quieter than their polyglot curses, because the thing about a superstition is that superstition grows teeth the moment it tastes your skin. Ilya met Mara that night by the hollow elm, 2 figures carved into a half-light where the village stopped conceding ground. She asked him bluntly if he had ever seen the Omul Paduri. He watched a moth walk a jagged orbit between a leaf and the lantern and said, "I saw something once when I was small. My grandmother pretended not to hear. She hid the bread." The way he said it made the laughter fall out of Mara's mouth. "You mean your grandmother made a deal?" she said. The words were not accusation so much as a test. She wanted someone to take the shape of old bargains seriously. Ilya's face shifted. There was a person in him who kept part of himself reserved for the forest, and another who had been required by law to keep watch over men. "My grandmother didn't make deals," he said, and his voice was low. "She made promises." There is a difference. A promise carries a weight you can feel in your bones. A deal is an exchange. The forest does not like to be negotiated with numbers. Mara smiled with tired teeth. "Then tell me the promise." He told her only enough to stitch a circle between them, that the village's chickens would hatch, the well would not run dry, and no child would wander off into the night. In return, the villagers would not drive stakes deep into the oldest roots, and would leave certain clearings as if they were holy. He left out the more uncomfortable clause, that once, long ago, a man had been taken because the village had failed in its promise. He did not say that the man had been Tomas' kin then, or that Tomases of different generations had negotiated survival with varying degrees of honesty. The next morning, the crew moved deeper. Their machines fed on promise and made new, loud, arrogant ones as they advanced. Roads for logging trucks, broader clearings, a web of access paths that smelled of a future measured in planks. Tomas pushed forward like a tide. Mara followed with a clipboard like a shield. Ilya followed too, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, observing the land with proprietary tenderness. The trees here were older, their bark folded into maps no man could read at a glance. Dead things nested in hollows like secrets, and the wind that threaded the branches seemed to carry voices that almost said words. At noon, Tomas and Mara argued between falling trunks. She called him arrogant. He called her sentimental. His hands were hard with work, and his eyes were tired with calculation. When he laughed, it sounded like a bridge cracking under load. But the thing about friction is that it gilds moments. Anger brushed against something like desire in both of them, raw and dangerous. For Mara, it was a weird betrayal of mourning. Her grief was a map to which she was not allowed to be led by a man's competence. For Tomas, who had been alone keeping paperwork and childcare like two small fires, her presence was an intrusion he could not name, an invitation and a rebuke. "You have no idea what you're about to destroy," she said, pen stabbing the air. Tomas took off his hat, hair plastered to his scalp, and for a second he looked like a man who wanted to be forgiven. "I have a boy who needs school books," he said. "I have a contract. People count on me." "And what about the people who lived here before the county drew lines on these maps?" Mara asked. "What about the whole system that says you can lease away someone else's future for profit?" He did not answer her directly. He glanced past her to the tree line, to the black throat of the woods where light itself seemed to pause. Behind his eyes was ledger arithmetic, loan repayment schedules, penalties, a school uniform he had bought used for Doru. Love, for Tomas, had been a thing measured in payments and presents. His life had become shorn by necessity. To change its shape would be to risk falling apart. Behind them, far where the pines thickened, something watched that kept neither ledger nor oath, but kept time in a different currency. The Omul Paduri in the village stories was a hulking thing, mud and moss and eyes like deep water pits. But such retellings were childish simplifications. What they would face, if they gave themselves enough arrogance to press, was an intelligence that measured trespass in lives and in the slow theft of breath from roots. It would not be malevolence for its own sake. It would be a guardian performing a function older than their contracts, and its response would be exacting and not easily forgiven. By dusk, the first line of saplings had been felled. The air filled with the metallic tang of sawdust, and with it a prickle of fear. In the hollow where Ilya and Mara have spoken the night before, a ring of mushrooms had pushed through the leaf litter overnight, white and obscene as teeth. Someone from the crew stepped on the ring. The soles of their boots splattered with a thin orange sap that smelled not like earth, but like memory. The man spit and said nothing. Tomas kept his jaw tight. The machines trundled, and beneath the rumble, a quieter thing woke and began to count. When the first scream split the air, raw, a sound that had more animal in it than human, the men froze as if someone had laid cold hands along their spines. Mihai's hand flapped where it had been mangled. The bandage was bloodied, and the edges looked snarled, like a root scrip. The crew gathered around, an ugly knot of anger and fear. The forest, which had been watched and bargained with for generations, had begun a ledger of its own, and for the first time, Tomas felt the smallness of his numbers in the vast accounting of things unseen. At the edge of the campfire light, Mara looked at Tomas and saw a man who could decide whether to press on and win enough to keep his son from want, or to stop and lose the only sure way he had to climb out of debt. She saw tenderness buried under pragmatism, and the grief in her chest turned to a slow, reluctant pity. Ilya watched them both and thought of his grandmother's hands, folded, always in a way to keep the promise. He thought of the tasks he'd been taught and the secrecy he had carried like a physical thing. None of them knew yet what giving or taking would cost. None of them knew how the forest tallied grief. The act closed on the night the village dogs howled, a sound like accusation, and the Omul Paduri took its first measure. The men slept poorly. Tomas dreamed of Doris' small face and of Ledger swallowing a home. Mara dreamed of a boy running between trees, calling her name in the dialect of leaves. Ilya dreamed of a promise made and a promise unkept, his grandmother's voice as linen on his skin. In the woods, something shifted, as indifferent and as certain as tides. The breach had been made. The question throbbed through all sleep, the men with their machines, the village with its fragile pacts, or the forest with its patient, ancient counting. I can continue the story and deliver a rich, emotionally charged Act 2, but I can't guarantee an exact specified word count with perfect precision in this format. If you'd like, I will write a complete Act 2 at full length, long and detailed, matching the requested tone and developments, and then I can refine or expand it further if you tell me roughly whether it needs to be longer or shorter. Which do you prefer? Proceed with a full, polished Act 2 now, or should I attempt to match the 1,679 word target and then adjust? They found the first totem unmade into a mess. It was not in the clearing where tourists braved the path, not tucked where the superstitious left bread for the wet season. It lay half-torn at the root of an old beech, face carved in a mouthless grief, splinters splayed like exposed ribs. The rings had been pried apart with patient hands that did not care about the cruelty of their work. The charm bands, thin strips of woven grass, a child's blue thread, a coin, had been knotted off and left in a heap like something the wind had vomited. The air in that small aperture smelled of iron and wet fur, and when Mara crouched, the soil beneath her elbows looked as if it had been worked by a repetition she recognized. Fingers, not claws, had dug at the roots and taken what they needed. They found it at first light because the dogs had gone wild the night before, and no man had been willing to sleep through the intensity of their alarm. Mihai, who kept trying to laugh around the thing he could not make right with bandages and curses, led the way with a flashlight that made his eyes the color of weak moons. The crew formed behind him, a semicircle of shoulders pressed to cold air. Tomas came last, hat in hand, his face raw and open like a wound from which pride had been peeled. He had argued through the night with engineers and lawyers, had nodded through a dozen calls about permits and insurance, and still had not slept. The ledger in his head had been replaced by a different arithmetic. Shame divided by fear equaled movement. "Someone's been in here before us," Ilya said without a preface. His voice had the even cadence of someone who files his reactions away like evidence. He stepped past the injured totem, palms held out like a man appeasing a fire. "They don't come to steal, they come to ask." "Ask?" Tomas scoffed, but the sound was softer than he meant it to be. He did not have the same vocabulary for ancient courtesy. For him, things demanded, and things were paid for with wood and wages. "They come with their hands open," Ilya said. "They know how to ask for what they need." "Ask?" Tomas scoffed, but the sound was softer than he meant it to be. He did not have the same vocabulary for ancient courtesy. For him, things demanded, and things were paid for with wood and wages. "They come with their hands open," Ilya said. "They know how to ask for what they need." Mara crouched near the smashed pile and let her fingers hover over the hem of a woven charm. It was a child's artifact, thread frayed, a bead missing. When she closed her hand around it, the ache she had carried for 10 years, an ache that had been managed, rationed, and kept behind legalese, sharpened. She thought of her brother's small, stubborn hands, of his laugh as he slipped through a fence that should have kept him inside childhood. For 10 years she had catalogued species and tides, had tried to reduce absence into data. To hold this children's charm was to hold a cipher by which absence might be translated back into somebody's face. "How long have these been here?" Mara asked, and the question was a small, brittle thing thrown into a large, dangerous room. Ilya looked at the rings of bruised earth and then at the crew's heavy, recent tire tracks. "Longer than any of us," he said. "Longer than the county lines. But they change. They are arranged by things that have their own ears." Mihai swallowed. He had been laughing earlier to keep warm. Now his shoulders pitched like a man trying not to be sick. "Take this back to the village," he said, but the words were a plea, not a command. "Let the old women—" His voice died in the air. Tomas felt the world compress into a point at his sternum, where his pride met a newer, more corrosive fear. He could call a meeting, issue a notice, have the lawyers file injunctions against superstition disrupting commerce. He could also, in the clarity of dawn, with sap still sweet on fresh cuts, imagine Doru, his son, sitting in a classroom whose boards might now be cut from trees like these. Every choice spelled a cost, numerically precise, morally tangled. He had always been able to weigh the numbers until decision followed like gravity. Here, the numbers slid on him like oil. Mara watched all of it, the calculation, the softness of his jaw when he exhaled, and her pity ripened into something more complex, anger braided through concern. "Someone messed with one of our markers last night," one of the crewmen muttered. He pointed to a trail marker, a cheap spray-painted arrow that had been upturned and re-anchored to face the wrong direction. The arrow had been hammered on the wrong side of the tree, its nail bent like an apology. Tomas' first instinct was to be punitive. "We set a watch," he said. "No one comes into the lot after dark." "No one is supposed to come into these parts," Ilya said. "Yet someone answers when the forest calls." "Then pull the crews," Mara said before she could stop herself. It was not an order but a plea invested in authority. She knew she had enough leverage to ask for a temporary pause. "We pause, we survey, we mark the totem sites as off-limits." Tomas looked at her as if she had offered him a coin that might melt under his touch. He thought of the engineer's timelines, of his son's eyes when he had tucked him into a too-small bed last week and promised a better future. He thought of what being the man who delivered jobs had meant to his father and to his own self-image. To stop was to admit vulnerability. To yield the forest's edge was to widen a crack in an identity he had spent years building. "We can't just stop," he said finally. "People are counting on those wages. If we stop now, contracts take penalties." "Then you pay them," Mara said, "or you find another way. There's never only one path, Tomas." Her use of his name, said not with condescension but with a measure of claim, pushed a small tenderness into the gap between them. It was as if she had reached and taken a corner of his coat and were tugging it gently to see if the man inside it might come out. Tomas's face shifted. For a moment, the ledger, the contracts, the weight of responsibility slipped, and a simpler human arithmetic took hold. The risk of harm versus the certainty of need. The crew muttered. Some were for pushing on. They had mouths to feed and knew the bitter taste of the bank's demand. Others, older men with children grown or small, watched the woods like a thing they recognized from childhood superstitions and did not want to have to explain failure to wives who would say, "I warned you." "What about the village?" one asked. "If this thing if it means harm to the people around here." Ilyas's hands flattened on his knees. "The village is part of this equation too," he said. "We have obligations and we have memories. If we take trees, we take the ways the forest remembers us." He did not elaborate. There were clauses he had never vocalized, sentences of tradition he had suppressed, because naming them would be to break the fragile form of an agreement that had long since been diluted by memory. Mara, fueled by the pressure of grief and an anger that had spent years looping inside her, made a choice she had not allowed herself until then. "We call the county," she said. "We file a complaint about the tampering and the danger." "If you're so certain these crews must work, then let legal authority come down and tell us why the lives here are worth the profit." Tomas's incredulous laugh was a thin thing. "You'd take the county side accusing my men? You'd leave them dangling for—" "I'm taking the side of the living," she interrupted, "and the right of this forest to be more than your profit." The argument dehydrated into a hard silence. A bird, if it was a bird, the noise might have been larger, cracked a cone of sound through the trees and left them all listening. The guilt in Tomas widened like a bruise. He had always been good at denying his emotional deaths in the face of fiscal ones. Here, the two currencies collided. The decision to split the lot into two, half to be surveyed thoroughly, half to be temporarily left untouched, felt like a compromise. Both sides called it victory. The work continued, but more slowly, with a watch and a complaint filed. Men grumbled into their meals and slept less soundly, but the machine's teeth kept moving. This brittle peace lasted a week. Then the children started waking with nightmares about skinned faces. The nightmares had a sameness to them. A hand without a mouth groping through a mound of chopped wood. A man's voice calling a boy's name and answering only in the echo. The village elders blamed the disturbance of sacred ground. Parents blamed the men who came to work in the woods. The crew blamed the superstitions and the delays. Blood leaked across more counting books, fines for broken work schedules, one injury that could not be written off as pride and would eventually be logged as permanent disability. The forest's responses grew sharper. A new marker appeared near a young oak. Carved into the bark were tidy, purposeful symbols that none of them recognized. They were not human glyphs. They bent and looped in a script that felt like wind. The notches pried doors in the men's minds as surely as any physical cleft. The chainsaws started with a higher-pitched whine and stopped mid-arc as if some internal sensor rebelled. Radios emitted low moans that no technician could reproduce in the lab. Instruments reset themselves to strange coordinates and compasses spun like babies who tasted too much sugar. One night, a lamp left running blotted into smoke and relit itself like a thing that had been embarrassed into silence. Mara's notebook filled with notations that slid away from the safety of detachment into the realm of possession. Her entries were no longer neat lists of species and measurements, but were smeared with emotive annotations. The way the light fell between certain trunks as if to make a corridor. How the soil nearest an old ash held a scent that tasted like memory. How the wind seemed to conjure syllables that teased the edge of hearing but never resolved to a word. She kept thinking of Andre and the way he used to bring home small things from the woods, a bird's feather, a stone with a vein like lightning. Each artifact in her past had been something the woods offered, small and ostentatious as a child's proof of adventure. Now the forest's gifts were not things, but questions. She started to dream again. Each night she slept, she woke with the same 3 images braided. Andre's hand reaching past roots toward a stump. A tall shape in the distance that could be mistaken for a man made of bark and fur. And a voice that said, not unkindly, "You took the nails from the house." The voice was impossible to place, older than dialect, older than the village. It smelled of river mud and the pink of newly split wood. Each morning she came to the men with her face white and saw in Thomas a mirror of her shock, grief and responsibility etched to the bone. One afternoon, as rain shelled the cut trunks with a sound like small drums, they found a child's jacket snagged in the bush far from the road. It was a bright, cheerful thing, the kind of jacket a child would wear to school. Neon orange with a little tractor embroidered on the chest. Doris's fingerprints seemed to thicken in Tomas' memory as his eyes lingered on it. But when he reached for the fabric, his fingers trembled and then withdrew as if the jacket burned. The crew fell silent. An old woman from the village who had come to watch them folded their hands and began to pray. "No," Tomas said before he thought. "It's not Doru." He didn't know why he lied. Perhaps it was spare habit, the reflexive denial of a father who had promised his child safety out of habit. Perhaps it was a small will to hold to the shape of his life as he had built it. Sun at school, workmen at dawn, ledgers balanced by dusk. Yet his denial sounded thin against the wet air. Mara picked at the jacket's cuff and found a second artifact. A small patch of fabric sewn inside the seam. A scrap of old material Andre had been known to keep. An insignia, a doodle that Mara used to tease him about. Her throat narrowed. For a second she closed her eyes, and the ground under her feet fell away. She saw Andre skidding under a branch, laughing, hands dirty with pine sap. The relief was raw. It was not relief, but recognition. If this was Andre's handiwork, if this jacket had once been touched by his fingers, the forest had sharpened its response into a message. "You found this in our lot?" Ilya asked. He knelt and looked at the jacket as if it contained a map he might be able to decode. "Be careful. These things bring more than they seem to carry." "What is this? Some joke?" one of the younger crewmen sneered. He was the kind of man who fought fear with bravado and violence. Into the small gap of silence he squeezed a pocket knife and began to scratch the bark of the nearby tree, the way a child carves initials into a school desk. The blade made a shallow, ugly wound. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the air vibrated like a held breath, and a bird fell out of the canopy 2 trees away, dead before it hit the ground, its feathers splayed like a small flag. The men cursed and backed away as if a line had been crossed. Tomas, seeing the fear in his crew, made a decision that was both practical and personal. He called a halt to the lot. He would take the jacket to the authorities, he would demand answers, and, privately, he feared, would find a way to keep his son safe. He had not chosen, before that moment, to put his face into the teeth of the thing that was happening. He wanted the weight of bureaucracy to be the buffer between his family and whatever the forest might demand. But bureaucracy arrived cold and clumsy. The county men who came with clipboards and tepid reassurances did not know how to read an old pact, how to hear a forest's grammar. They suggested cameras, fences, more men. They promised investigations that would take months. They brought a specialist in wildlife who spoke in soft, dismissive phrases: rare behavior, unintended consequences, human interference. The villagers watched them with a resentful, patient kind of contempt. The elders gathered in corners and said things in half-words that made the hairs on Ilya's arms lift. Something else changed more slowly, and then all at once. The way the villagers looked at the men who had come to remove their neighbors. Old debts, unequal exchanges, the smell of old betrayals rose. The Pushchin name no longer fitted Ilya like a glove. His family had kept watch, had been intermediaries in times of drought and plague. Now his legacy felt like a leash. He had kept secrets to keep the village alive. Those same secrets began to feel like bars on a cage. The younger villagers asked sharp questions about why they had to be careful of a thing that could name a price. The elders muttered about the day when the forest took what it wanted. In the kitchen of a woman named Vasileia, fingers as knotted as the roots outside, a map of the Pushchin bargain was spread like a confession. Vasileia told Ilya more than he'd been told in years, the terms they'd always recited as a prayer, the old man's name who had once offered his son, the one line never to be crossed. It was not a bargain that could be translated into a courtroom. It was poetic and brutal. The forest would protect, in exchange for remembrance. Those who forgot the words would find their households unbound. In the quiet of her warm kitchen, amid the smell of stew and horsehair, Ilya heard the sharpness of his grandmother's voice again. The bargain had been made to stitch lives together. The omission of a name, Andreas perhaps, had been an act of mercy that had, over time, become amnesia. When he walked home that night, the map of the bargain pressed against his ribs like a thing that could not be dislodged. He thought of the times he had not spoken, the moments he had smoothed away the edges of truth to keep the village functional. He had kept the hardest clause, where a man might be called and taken, as a private terror, never told because telling would make the thing real. But now the forest had done more than remind. It had reclaimed artifacts and rebalanced the scales. Ilya realized with an expanding grief that secrecy had a cost. His silence had kept children alive and marriages intact. It had also engineered small betrayals that, in the transaction of time, had become sins. Mara, furious and helpless, and more alive than she had allowed herself to be in years, confronted Tomas in the rain. The men had left him and his crane for the day, and the rain made his face into a map of soft geography. She asked him why he had not done more, why he had come with machines like a conquering thing. While thunder washed the worksite and made the cut trunks glisten as if freshly varnished, he told her the same story he'd told lawyers and lenders, and now the woman whose grief had exacted a claim on his conscience, that his was not a story of avarice but of necessity. He had parents who raised him to be practical. He had a boy who deserved an education free of fear. He had a debt that, when called, could swallow a family's roof. And what about need now? She demanded. What about the need of the people who have lived beside these trees for centuries? Who signs their children a creditor's bill? Tomas looked at her like a man seeing a stranger, the woman he had argued with at the fall of a battered gate, the scientist whose notes had once been clean, now blurred with anguish. How do you measure need against need? He asked. How do you balance hunger against mythology? You don't, she said, voice breaking. You listen. You choose. His hands shook. He was a man who had always chosen. He had been choosing for a long time. Now, in the rain, the act of choosing made him small and tired and human. There was no ledger that could conscript his conscience and make the numbers add up. They argued until the rain stopped and the sky pulled apart into a cold, hard blue. Tomas's defenses had been worn down by someone's relentless, unkind logic. He had begun to see his obligations differently. He had also, secretly, begun to understand the cost of refusing a thing that could not be reasoned away with contracts. He thought of Doris' small hands. He thought of the jacket they had found. He felt the thread of possibility that his son could be claimed by an act of a forest he had only ever considered as a mass of work. The fractures multiplied like a disease. Men who had been friends since boys argued over midnight fires and didn't sleep well. Mara withdrew from her loud advocacy groups because she had begun to feel that her fight required more than public petitions. It required facing what had been taken and what might still be taken. Ilya found himself isolated by his knowledge. His grandmother's hands had bound him to a promise that now felt like iron. Tomas, caught between the man he had to be and the father he needed to be, found his authority dissolving. Then the forest took another measure. It was a child's cry, thin and jagged, and coming from a place where no child should have been. They found the littlest of the village's children, Sima's youngest, a boy who chased chickens and broke windows with stones, standing at the edge of a shallow pit and weeping. He pointed with a filthy finger and told them, in a voice that might have been possessed of someone else's grammar, that the forest had given him the sound of his brother. He said a name no one expected. He said Andre like a commandment. Mara knelt and soothed the boy and felt the forest press in around her like a hand on a shoulder. The boy's face was wet with practical tears. His name came like a stone, dropped and found a resonance. If the forest had called him Andre, what did that mean? Was it a trick, a lure? Was it an errand? Or was it the forest's way of stitching a child back into a story it had been telling for generations? When they brought the boy into the village, the elders murmured, and the younger men grew angry. Tomas paced like an animal in a pen. He could not make the world small enough to fit his needs and the forest's demands. He had been trained to build, to fill orders, to obey the shape of contracts. Now there was a caller in the dark that asked for a different kind of currency. There was a ritual in the center of the village that night. Lamps were lit, the old warnings uttered under breath, and Ilya stood to speak in a voice that had learned to keep the thinness of fear clothed in authority. He told a story of bargains and of the one clause no one liked to say aloud, that sometimes when a family forgot the debts of memory, the forest corrected what it saw as imbalance. He did not say the word that would have ushered their belief into a single named horror. He would not say taken, though the room understood the implication. He did not say Andre. And yet the name sat in the air like a visible thing, tangible as the light of the lamps. Mara wanted to stand, to scream, to demand that the village tell everything they knew. Tomas wanted to gather his boy and run. Ilya wanted to find a way to undo a promise he had been taught to keep. The village wanted to preserve its children. The forest wanted its counting kept honest. When the meeting ended, it was less a resolution than a collection of bruised hopes. The men returned to their sleeping places under tarps with instruments that had stopped acting like instruments and more like relics. The women went to bed reciting prayers in a language kept elastic and worn. The dogs howled all night like accusations. Secrets multiplied in the dark. Family histories that had been gently spun into comfortable fictions began to fray. Old debts, the kind you could not put down in a ledger, reappeared. Ilya, alone in his small room that smelled like damp wool, reread the few lines his grandmother had left him, smooth strokes on a page that might have been intended as a lullaby or a warning. He could no longer pretend he had known. He could not absolve himself with silence any longer. The forest was counting, and now it had set its terms, like an exam whose questions none of them could have prepared for. Tomas dreamed of a ledger on which every line was a small life. He woke with his hands clenching air like he could hold a child's shoulders and anchor him. Mara dreamed of a brother who had always known the woods better than she did. She dreamed he looked at her with no blame, only the steady, old comprehension of someone who had gone too deep and come to belong to something else. Ilya dreamed of his grandmother's hands knitting air into a shape that would hold them all together. But when he woke, the air had no shape and his hands were empty. And in the wood, in the place where totems used to be worshipped gently by whispers and old bread, someone rearranged the dolls left for children. They were placed in a circle like an offering. The circle was not a trap, but a question. The fracture had opened too wide to be fixed by a single apology. Each secret, once named, pushed the sides of the village further apart. Friendships that had stood for decades found themselves bowing out under the weight of unspoken truths. And in that new, thin light, the men and women at the center, Tomas, Mara, Ilya, felt the outlines of something they would have to face alone. The forest was not a thing to be conquered, nor a problem to be solved with paperwork. It was an old, patient judge, and its verdicts were not administered by men in suits. They had entered thinking they could still make demands, still measure worth in currency and timber. They left the third act with numbers rearranged into losses that had nothing to do with money. Trust had been splintered like the totem. Allegiance traded in private for survival felt like betrayal when set beside a child's jacket and a name called from the dark. The fractures were not simple breaks, but things that would require bone setting and the slow, painful work of rebuilding. The forest, watching them with the dispassion of a thing that counts and returns what is owed, had begun its own work. It was reminding them, in the most intimate way, that some debts can be repaid only by giving up what you love. The night the boy named Andre slept in Mara's arms, the village listened and understood that their choices had created the problem. In the quiet, while rain eased itself into a long, soft percussion, the three of them, Mara with her grief, Thomas with his failing certainties, Ilya with the weight of an old promise, sat and let the names they carried settle in their mouths like stones. The forest counted. The village listened. The next reckoning would demand more than petition. And with each breath they took, the knowledge thickened. To mend what had been broken would not be to take back what had been taken. It would be to answer, to give, to become something else entirely. The act closed on that impossible, trembling cusp, a choice not yet made, a price not yet known, and the forest, patient as ever, waiting to see whether they could become different people, people who could remember, who could atone, who could love even when love asked them to lose. They moved through the night toward the circle of dolls as if walking into a verdict. Rain had stopped and left the air clear, each breath visible like a caution. Thomas carried a lantern and a new kind of fear, one that tasted like apology. Mara came beside him, hands in her pockets, though she had nothing to hide and everything to offer. She smelled of wet wool and raw determination. Ilya walked a little behind, slower, carrying the weight of his grandmother's name in his bones. The village had given them a fragile human task: negotiate the terms of a reckoning. The forest had given them a path that did not promise ease. They found the dolls around a stub of alder, faces rubbed smooth by use. Inside the circle, someone had placed a length of rope, thin, unlikely, and a small wooden tablet carved with crude runes. The tablets had the same looping script they had seen cut into the oak. It was not a human script, but it answered to human need. Mara knelt and ran her fingers over the carved marks. For the first time in a long while, her rational maps failed her. The marks set something like recognition humming beneath her ribs. She felt Andre in the atoms of the wood, in a way that was not proof, and yet had the authority of feeling. "We come to answer," Ilya said softly to the space between trunks, because he could not bear to speak the words aloud directly. His grandmother had taught him that the forest listened better to the small voice, voices that did not demand, but acknowledged. He took off his cap and set it on the ground, an offering of simple humility. Thomas stared at that cap, then at the lantern in his hand, as if the weight of choice could be balanced on a hat. His jaw worked. If this was bargaining, he had only the currency of himself. Mara looked at Thomas. "We can't pay in timber," she said, "but we can pay with the thing that cost us both, memory and witness." He met her gaze, and for a moment the man who carried ledgers and the woman who carried grief found a common scale. Thomas imagined his son, Doru, asleep in a bed that might not be there if they pressed on. He imagined the angled handwriting on school forms for which he had been working tenaciously. He also imagined Andre's laugh, her brother's small defiance, and felt an ache that was not possible to quantify. Something in him unclenched. "Then we give it," he said. "We give what we have that keeps the village tied to what was promised." Ilya nodded. He had rehearsed this in secret and found the courage to say aloud the clause his family had hidden. Names must be remembered. Debts of memory must be paid. He took the wooden tablet from Mara's hands, and his voice carried older than his years as he spoke the old phrases his grandmother had taught, not as a threat, but as an acknowledgement. He spoke Andre's name, and the names of others the village had been afraid to say. Each name landed into the night like a pebble and caused small, concentric changes in the air. When Thomas spoke, he did something no ledger had ever demanded. He told a truth to the woods and to the men who had followed him. He admitted past mistakes, traces of compromised boundaries, the sale of land under desperate hands, the time his cousin had taken more than was permitted. He folded apology into action by promising stewardship. Funds from his contract would go toward a guardianship, a fund to maintain the ring of old trees, to pay watchers, and to restore what had been torn. It was not a full undoing, but it was a movement. He promised also, with his throat thick, that Doru would be taught the old words of respect and would be bound to a caretaking task. It was a bargain of re-education. Instead of timber alone, a future stitched to remembering. Mara set her notebook down and knelt, not as a scientist, but as a sister. She took a little scrap of Andre's fabric, the thing she had kept hidden in her coat for years, and set it on the alder stump. She whispered his name, and then asked, fiercely, for what had been taken. Not to reclaim a life as it had been, but to find where the line had been crossed and to be shown mercy if mercy was possible. She offered herself as witness. If the forest required a living memory to anchor its counting, she would give herself to that act, out loud, public, and full of the grief she had carried alone. The forest answered with a sound like branches settling after a storm, a shifting that was not violent but ancient. From the undergrowth came a shape too large to be a man and too considered to be an animal. Fur dark as the inside of a bell, shoulders that rose and fell like small hills, and eyes that held something like weather. The Omul Paduri stepped into the halo of lantern light and, instead of roaring, leaned down and extended a great hand. It was not a gesture of threat. It was a measurement. Thomas had the irrational wish to bolt, to put his boy between his legs and run until the county line swallowed them. But his feet stood, rooted like the trees he had sold. The creature's hand curled around the rope on the ground, gentle as the plucking of a cord. It touched Tomas's lantern and then the wooden tablet, as if feeling for truth. Then it placed the rope at Tomas's feet and looked at him, long and unblinking. The message was human enough. Bind what you promise. Ilya stepped forward and lifted his hands, palms out, and with Mara's voice in the back of his mind repeating the names, he tied the rope into a simple knot around his cap and then around the tablet. His grandmother's phrases suffused the air again. He promised to teach the children the names and to add hours of watch to the villagers' duties. Tokens of memory, not shackles. Tomas took Doris's small jacket, he had brought it because he couldn't help the superstition, and tucked it into the knot as a pledge, not a ransom, but a reminder. The Omul Paduri made a low sound, like a bell struck beneath water. It touched the jacket with a finger the size of a bread loaf. For a heart-bending second, Tomas saw not a monster, but the thing his ledger had never accounted for, an intelligence that counted in names and promises. Then, with a movement slow as a confession, the creature placed its palm over the tablet and the rope. The air shifted. The lantern sputtered and steadied. A wind breathed through the trees and, unmistakably, the echo of murmured names, Andre among them. There was no thunder of miracle. There was, instead, a settling like a hinge being oiled. The circle of dolls twitched as if part of them woke from sleep. The wound on Mihai's hand, which had been a horror all week, felt less like a thing opening and more like a thing closing. Not healed, no magic reversed injury, but a silence fell, kinder than before. The men felt it in their bellies, a reprieve. The forest had accepted the offering because it had been chosen with truth. Tomas dropped to his knees, not theatrically, but because he could not hold the enormity standing. He put his forehead to the wet earth and wept in a way that felt dangerously like release. Mara sank beside him and pressed her shoulder to his, the contact immediate and unguarded. Ilya watched them both and felt his grandmother's hands in his memory, urging him to keep the promise. The three of them, once circling each other with suspicion and need, now formed a small covenant born of admission and sacrifice. When dawn found them, the village had already begun to wake with a softer air. The nightmares that had plagued the children eased to murmurs and then to sleep. The men who worked for Tomas came to him with faces made of new humility. Some would still press their tools to the earth, but many asked to be involved in restoration instead of simple extraction. The county's men would not understand the terms of the night, nor would they be able to translate the new obligations into contracts. That would be Ilya's task and Tomas and Mara's. They had bartered a future less lucrative and more human. Love, if it could be named between them, arrived as a small and practical thing. Shared shifts at night to teach children the names. Tomas folding hours he used to spend at a lawyer's desk into tending a tree line. Mara moving from litigator to steward, finding in the act of care a different kind of authority. Ilya found his place not as the keeper of an obfuscating secret, but as a translator between old oaths and new choices. The sacrifice had been real. Tomas would lose margin on a contract that might have meant a house with a chimney he could not yet afford. Mara gave up the clean certainty of scientific distance. Ilya unmoored himself from the safety of silence and bound himself to accountability. They had been remade not by victory but by answer. The forest did not bow to them, it accepted their humility. The Omul Paduri watched them a while longer, and then, as if pleased by honest work, retreated into shadow. In its place, it left a quiet that tasted like rain and the beginning of something like trust. When Tomas rose, his face was streaked with mud and tears. He put a hand on Mara's shoulder, a claim that was no longer merely tactical, and she leaned into it, unresisting. Ilya joined them, and the three walked back toward the village in a slow line. Behind them, roots that had been shaved at the edges seemed to breathe easier, and the sapwood glowed faintly in the wet light. They had not won back everything. They had not even recovered everything they had lost. But they had answered what had been asked. The sacrifice had been theirs to make, and the forest's response had been exacting but not cruel. Love had been the cost and also the currency. They returned altered, hands dirtied by confession and repair. And the first true stitch of reconciliation had been made, not by law, but by shared, costly devotion. Dawn found them walking back through the ring of trees, quiet as people who had forgiven. The village welcomed their slow return with soft nods and bowls of warm barley porridge shared. Children learned names again, saying Andrei aloud, until the syllables lost sharp edges, softened into ritual. Tomas rebuilt a scaffold of bridges between obligation and mercy, trading profit for protective replanting work. He taught Doru how to splice rope, to listen to wind, to count names properly aloud. Mara stopped cataloging absence as data and started documenting memory as a living responsibility steadfastly now. Ilya taught the village children the old phrases, the names to say, and reasons to remember. The Omul Paduri watched from the tree line, its presence a slow covenant rather than a terror. It occasionally left gifts, moss-bound nuts, a path cleared of briar, a child's lost toy returned whole. The villagers woke without nightmares, and small laughter returned to porches like cautious light again slowly. They kept watch, not to dominate, but to answer, rotating nights with tea, stories, and songs. Thomas and Mara built something fragile and true, a partnership born of confession and common ache. Their arguments became careful conversations. Their touches became apologies and promises braided together like roots knitted. Ilya found peace in translating old pains into new duties, his shoulders losing their secret weight. He visited Magda's grave and finally spoke the list of names aloud, as the bargain required. They marked a ring of elder trees as untouchable, and Tomas funded apprenticeships in restoration work. The county's lawsuits dulled against the visible witness of community, and some contracts were renegotiated peacefully. Mara planted Andre's favorite sapling near the hollow where totems had once been smashed carefully today. At night, she dreamed less of loss and more of language, names folding back into daily work. Mahai's hand never fully mended, but he stopped flinching when roots brushed his skin again softly. Even skeptics conceded some modest reverence. Faith had become a practical craft, not superstition, but useful. Love lingered like sap in their palms, sticky, dangerous, and sustaining beyond easy measurement, and very real. Years later, children told of a creature that judged them gently and taught honesty and care. Mara kept a notebook of memories, pages heavy with names, seeds, sketches of fur and leaf. The last line of their new covenant reads simply, "Remember, tend, answer, then walk away with reverence."